Good afternoon, and isn't this been a wonderful day so far?
Yes.
Well, let's hope you still feel that way after me. I am not Diogenes looking for an honest politician. I'm trying to make a point about rural electrification and how much we take for granted in our modern world. So I hope when you leave this today, you'll have a greater appreciation of the benefits of what I consider to be the greatest technological advancement in modern history, and how for many, many years it was denied to an important part of our population, and how it finally got out here. And I'm also hoping that you'll finally figure out what that blue boat is doing sitting out there on the railroad bed just south of Rodeo. So, without further ado, I can't light this up because if I did, the smoke alarm would go off. I'm serious. These kerosene lanterns were smoky, did not produce much light. In fact, the ambient light in here right now is about the maximum amount of light that you could possibly get from a good quality kerosene lantern. So what I want to do is start by telling you a little bit about this slide. This is a muralist, an artist from the New Deal era, 1930s, named David Stone Martin, and this is called Rural Electrification. And it's kind of a heroic depiction of what it was like to bring light and power to people who had never had either one in their lives before. So, you've all heard about the good old days. All right. This is before rural electrification, before electricity, period. People lived by lantern light. After dark, you didn't have much illumination in your household unless you were rich. And cooking was a drudge. Women had the roughest time of all because cooking on a wood-burning stove was a horrible, horrible experience. Keeping the stove hot, bringing in wood, and cutting wood sometimes if your husband or your kids weren't there, it was a difficult time of life. Part of the job was trimming lamp wicks and also cleaning the chimneys. And if you lay this on your side like I did, now it's held together with Gorilla Glue, you've got the recipe for a fire in your house or your barn. These were dangerous, but it was all you had. If you were a woman, not only did you have the responsibility of doing all the household chores, you had to bring in the water from your hand-pumped well, however far away that was your household. Every pail of water that went in that house came in your hands. Because dad's off working and your sons are off, hopefully in school, or doing something else too. So you're doing all the chores, ladies. Before electricity, there was no such thing as a refrigerator unless you had a gas-operated refrigerator that Ray Eddington sold out here in Rodeo. So what you had to do is find the nearest town that sold ice, bring it in, and a 100-pound block of ice would hopefully last you for a week. Most people used canned foods, dried foods, and salted foods. Clarence Birdseye and his frozen products were a long way off. And wash day was torture. This is as modern as it got. Women used 3 wash basins or tubs, one for the washing, one for the rinsing, and one for the bluing for every load, which meant that you had to put more hot water on the stove to heat up for each one of those basins. This was an all-day event just to wash your clothes. Now, how do you do it these days? You flip a switch, put in your laundry detergent, and the machine does it for you without you having to do a single blessed thing after that. Ironing, why do they call them irons? That's cast iron. That's 6 to 7 pounds. Each one of those cast iron sad irons, as they were known, for a good reason. And you had to have several sitting on the top of your stove at any given time heating up because they lose their heat very quickly. So one shirt, one iron. And if you weren't careful, you got soot on the shirt and your husband was all ticked off, so you had to wash the shirt again and do the whole thing. So think about washing as a hot, dirty, hard day, not just a few minutes. And of course, Outdoor plumbing, because before electricity, there's no water pump, there's no water pressure in your house, so you went to the little shack out back. Bathing was Saturday night in a tub to get ready for Sunday morning, once a week. So if you're out working in the fields or riding out on your pasture, on your ranch, you're getting pretty ripe by Saturday afternoon. Life was not a bed of roses before electricity. And if you have kerosene lamps, you also have, this is downtown Bisbee in 1908, after the catastrophic fire that was probably started by a kerosene lamp.
What year was that?
1908. And then came in 1879, Thomas Edison, who submitted an application for a patent for a filament that could last for weeks in a light bulb. That revolutionized America, revolutionized the world, because all of a sudden, with electrical current and a light bulb that could last more than a few minutes, you could fill up your room with beautiful, bright, white light. A game changer. But there were other applications, of course, for electricity too, not just light, but power. And Michael Faraday, decades before, had already come up with the primitive electric motor. So by this time, there were all kinds of folks that were inventors and engineers that had come up with electric motors. And this is Thomas Edison here, who takes the credit for a lot of people's hard work. On the right is Nikola Tesla, the son of a Serbian Orthodox priest, emigrated to the United States, and we love Serbs in Bisbee. He came up with the concept of alternating current. Edison used direct current, which was not nearly as efficient for transmitting power over long distances. Edison and Tesla got into a long-lasting feud over whether AC or DC. Eventually that turned, of course, into a hard rock band. But which one was the better one? Thomas Edison went so far as to electrocute an elephant with AC current and film it. You can look this up on YouTube. I'm not making this up. 1893 at the Chicago exhibition, George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla demonstrated that AC current was the preferred way, and we still use AC current, of course, today. So alternating current is the way to transmit electricity over long distances. Why you can get electricity from Four Corners, you can get electricity from up northern New Mexico, you can get it from Palo Verde plant, you can get it from the Apache generating station down by Dragoon, and it can travel hundreds, even thousands of miles. And this is, Americans, the world became fascinated with light and power. So this is the 1893 Columbian Exposition, Chicago World's Fair, where they illuminated buildings with light at night. It was beautiful. You want to see an example of this? Go to Lakeside Amusement Park in Denver, Colorado. They still have the original buildings. They're still covered with electric lights. It is magical. Fortunately, they're not using the original carnival rides. But it is wonderful. What did you get out of that? Until they came up with high-capacity transistors and capacitors, spaghetti strings of lights. This is New York City. So there's a few downsides to the magic of electricity, but it's transforming people's lives. But not everybody's lives got transformed. 9 out of 10 people by 1930 who lived in urban areas, that is, populations of more than 2,000 people, had electricity in their homes. In rural America, 9 out of 10 people did not have electricity. So you had two different worlds. You had the first world of the urban environment, and you had the second world of the rural environment. Arizona had an unusually high number of people that lived in rural areas that had electricity by the 1930s because the Roosevelt Dam had been constructed in 1914 on the Salt River, bringing electricity to Maricopa and Pinal County rural farms and ranches. New Mexico had 3.3% of its population. It was one of the lowest in the country to have rural electricity. If you lived in this area, the chances that you had electricity outside of Hachita or Rodeo or Columbus, and those were only to selected people that had the money to buy generators, or if you lived in Cade Creek Canyon and you had a guest ranch that had a portable generator. Other than that, you had nothing other than the good old days with the privies and the sad irons and the kerosene lanterns and all the other terrible things. So this was the state, 1930s in the United States, the haves and the have-nots. What else is going on in the 1930s? The Great Depression. So life for rural people went from bad to horrible. Farm prices plummeted because of the economic depression. This is a farm being auctioned off. Those are armed National Guardsmen with loaded weapons holding back a potential lynch mob of farmers watching one of their brothers having his farm auctioned off. This was horrible. This is a family walking down the highway with what meager possessions they could carry with them, leaving their home. And of course, the Dust Bowl is going on too. This is a wretched time to live in rural America. Wretched. And then 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected, and he's promising happy days are here again, and he has a plan to implement those happy days. What he's going to do is propose some transformative programs that are going to make life better for a lot of people. And we're hoping, in fact, today, we can still see the evidence of those programs in the Chiricahua Mountains and right around us here in Hidalgo and Cochise counties. The first 100 days, all kinds of legislation passed. The Agricultural Adjustment Act to protect prices for farmers so that they didn't have to have their farms auctioned off. The Civilian Conservation Corps to put hundreds of thousands of unemployed young people back to work doing something honorable with dignity and building infrastructure in parks, check dams, and other things. This infrastructure still exists today, right down the road in Cave Creek. And the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley, and if you're from Tennessee, you know what I'm talking about. It's beautiful country, but back in those days, it was desperately poor, undeveloped. So what the TVA did was to establish dams and reservoirs all over the Tennessee Valley that provided several things. One was flood control. The second was improved navigation on the river. And the third was hydroelectric power from those dams. And one of the things that was in the act that the TVA was in was to prioritize rural cooperative organizations as having access to that inexpensive power. This was the kernel, the germ of the Rural Electrification Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority. By the way, the TVA is still in existence today. In 1935, the country's still struggling, and Roosevelt signs an executive order creating the Rural Electrification Act. This is a temporary thing under a relief bill that provided a certain amount of money, but just one-time thing to start rural electrification. It was totally inadequate because it didn't provide for the funding for the infrastructure of administrators and electrical engineers that it was going to take to make this work, and it had no ongoing funding. So a year later, Congress passed the Rural Electrification Act, which was a permanent bill that provided a permanent funding source. It provided enough money so that there was money to hire administrators, money to hire brilliant, young, dedicated electrical engineers who probably didn't have a job doing anything else, but now they could do something really good because they could bring electricity to poor people in rural areas. And they took this incredibly seriously. They were like the missionaries of electricity going out to the world to bring light and power to people that had never had anything other than this. And these were the advertisements that they started seeing in newspapers. It's coming to you. Now, of course, these poor people had heard a lot of promises before from a lot of elected officials and snake oil salesmen. And there is nothing more suspicious than a country person that hears his life's going to change. Except these people meant it, and they had the resources to do it. And this is an actual quote from somebody that had electricity brought to his home. He was a fundamentalist church member in North Carolina, and this is what he said. This is not an exaggeration, and there were quotes like this that came in. There were letters that were signed or addressed to President Roosevelt. Mabel Brown, anybody know Mabel Brown? Lived in Elfrida. I had her as a case when I worked for Cochise Health Systems. Mabel was a sweet old lady. She was 91 years old when she told her story to the Sulphur Springs Valley Electric Co-op for their history. She said in 1939, December, they finally had electricity in Elfrida. Never had it before. Said the biggest thrill that the kids in Elfrida ever had was Christmas lights on their tree. Think of that. A 103-year-old woman wrote to Franklin Roosevelt a letter to the president. And she said, "Dear sir, I'm a very old woman. I wish electricity had come sooner, but I'm glad I lived long enough to see it. God bless you, Mr. Roosevelt." It really transformed people's lives. There are accounts of children in schoolhouses just getting up and cheering when the light bulb over their classroom first started glowing dimly and then brilliantly when their electrical grid was energized. People cried in their homes. This was transformative for these poor people. Now, how do you sell this? The Rural Electrification Administration had to do several things. First of all, they had to put the word out, and they did this on a national basis through radio, through print media, every way that they could. This is coming to you. You have the ability to do this. You do it yourselves. They created a model where community leaders, such as in Sulphur Springs Valley, such as in the Columbus area, all over the United States in rural areas, they get a hold of the community leaders and say, "We're going to bring this to you. We are going to provide you with low-interest, long-term loans, 25-year, later 30-year loans at very low interest. You're going to be able to afford to pay this back, and it'll be put into your electric bill, but it's not going to hurt you, and your electric bills will be low." Of course, there was some suspicion at first, but once people started seeing what was going on in other parts of the country, they realized, these guys, this is not a scam. This is not a BS story. This is for real. We can get this. So what they had to do was to get together with local leaders in the community, hold meetings, and develop a plan for electrifying their area. They had to do this themselves. So people actually went out and canvassed their own neighborhoods. They went out and mapped out potential grid lines. And the most fervent volunteers for this, who were they? Women. Because they knew what kind of a change this was going to make in their lives. So this is a Sulphur Springs Valley Electric Co-op cooking class. Because you got to learn how to cook with electricity. It's different than cooking on a wood-burning stove. And this is a rural electrification agent or outreach agent coming in and explaining, these are how to use a floor lamp, how to set the shade, because these folks had no idea how to do this, how to use a waffle iron, how to use an electric washer, how to turn on a radio. This is how an electrical grid works for those of you who may not know. Is this anybody's way? Because I'll move this back. Y'all see in the kerosene lamp now. You have a power generating station. It goes to a transformer that steps up the power to high voltage. It then goes over long distance lines to a step-down transformer that turns it into lower voltage that can go to a factory, a home, for useful electrical purposes, so it doesn't burn out your circuits. So it goes up in power of voltage and goes down in voltage. So when you see those transformers out here now, you'll know what they do. We're going to start with the Sulphur Springs Valley Electric Co-op, and I'm going to call it SSVEC because it's too dang long to say every time. We're going to look at two different electric co-ops, SSVEC and Columbus. How many of you are Columbus subscribers? God bless your hearts. How many of you are SSVEC? You're on the other side of the valley from them, aren't you? That's what we'll talk about them first, because this is one of the most successful rural electric co-ops in the country. It was the first in Arizona, and it is still operating today in large scale. This is Mark Bliss. He was an agricultural extension agent for the University of Arizona based in Wilcox. If you don't know what an ag extension agent is, he's a fellow that goes out and helps farmers and ranchers, teaching them new things about agronomy, about animal husbandry, to improve the quality of their stock, to improve the quality of their crops, teach them about new fertilizing techniques, teach them about new irrigation techniques. He's the missionary of agriculture. And in 1936, he found out about the Rural Electrification Act, and he said, we are primed for that because Sulphur Springs Valley had no electricity to speak of. There was a small electrical mom and pop electric company that provided power for San Simon and Bowie and Wilcox, but nothing for the farmers and ranchers out in the valley. So, following the model that the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, set up, he went out, had meetings with people in McNeil and then in Wilcox, got them organized, got them thinking about how are we going to do this thing? We're going to do it like this. We're going to set up a board of directors. The board of directors is going to hire Mike Bennett, the first manager for the SSVEC, and then we're going to apply for a loan to the REA to get two things. One is an electrical grid for the valley, and the second is a generating plant. Public meeting, everybody's got to vote. No lobbyists. That's the transformer out in McNeil. Costs $5, by the way, to join. They got almost $500,000 from the government, the purpose of which was to build an electric grid down the Sulphur Springs Valley, and the second was to build a power plant out by McNeil. Putting up the poles by hand. Some of these were paid people, a lot of them were volunteers because they had a stake in this. They had a dog in the fight. Getting the poles up, delivering the wire. And the REA had invented, these young electrical engineers and administrators, guys with missionary zeal, they came up with an assembly line process where there were teams. One would mark the spots where the poles would go. Another team would come in and dig the holes. Another team would follow along behind with the poles. Another team would follow along behind with all the things that went on the poles. It was like clockwork. It was like building a railroad back in the 1860s. They could get an electrical grid up in days or weeks, depending on the length of the grid. And finally, you have power. These were the generators that were in the McNeil plant, which is now part of the Fiesta Cannery. And this is Miss C.M. Reynolds. She was the secretary for the co-op. She's going to, by pushing a button, energize the grid. And Mabel Brown's family will have their Christmas tree lights. That's the plant, and that's now part of the Fiesta Cannery out off of Central Highway, 191 in McNeil. What did it do? It transformed the Sulphur Springs Valley into a verdant area for cotton, pinto beans, corn, and chilies. Suddenly, these poor dirt farmers were able to grow crops efficiently because in order to get to that water down there in the water table, you need electric pumps. That's what these fellows are doing. They've got high-capacity pumps that are now putting out water that can irrigate their crops out in the valley. And listen to the radio. And what was one of the very first programs that came down on the radio for these people? The Farm and Ranch Report. And this is Jim Sober. He is a line extension engineer. He's riding a mule out cross country to mark off a new set of electrical lines. What did they have to do in order to get the land? They had to ask the owners for an easement. Donate part of your property that you've been working on. Most of the owners of that property said, hell yes, if I'm getting electricity out of this, I'll be glad to. So it was pretty easy. That is a repair truck. That was the very first repair truck that SSVEC had. That's just made out of parts. They didn't have custom-made repair trucks in those days. That's called the Hesperus, after the wreck of the Hesperus. But that's what people did in order to get this to their homes. So this was the very first part of the grid right here. This is right down Sulphur Springs Valley. So from Wilcox and up into Graham County, actually, and down to right outside of Douglas, this was the area that was first electrified. This was 1940. It's still in progress. They're still doing it. The war slowed things down because some of those valuable pieces of material such as copper wire and steel and things like that were going to war. But they continued doing some things. They bought up that power plant and electric company that provided power, SSVEC did, for Tombstone and San Simon. That became part of their electrical system. They also started electrifying the town site of Fry, right outside Fort Huachuca. So where all the construction workers were working that turned Fort Huachuca from a garrison of 1,000 to 30,000 overnight. So that's why Sierra Vista is part of Sulphur Springs Valley Electric Co-op grid. 1950, San Simon and Bowie, Wilcox, Benson, San Pedro Valley, Sulphur Springs Valley, and more on the way. So it's growing. In order to make it grow, they'd apply for another loan. They'd pay off part of it, and they'd get another loan. And as the grids grew and there were more subscribers, they were able to get bigger and bigger loans. So this is what Sulphur Springs Valley is like today. It covers the entirety of Cochise County, goes up into Graham County. Now notice it doesn't cover a certain part of Cochise County. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But it gets over to Patagonia. So all those aging hippies in Patagonia also have Sulphur Springs Valley Electric Co-op. Bisbee and Douglas started with their own improvement companies at the turn of the century, 1900. They were bought up by Arizona Edison, and then they were bought up by APS in 1952. So they're on a different power grid. Fort Huachuca gets its power from Tucson Electric Power. That is a contract that they bid on and won in 1942 because this huge expanding fort needed electricity. The benefits: saving labor, doing things that you needed a hired hand for before. Hired hand's not going to call in sick if it's a 1 horsepower electric pump. And for housewives, for farm wives and ranch wives, think of all the labor-saving things that they had. An electric washer, even if it has a wringer, saves hours of work. An electric range saves hours of work. All vacuum cleaner, all the things that electricity does that human labor and sweat equity took care of before. As the SSVEC grid grew and the number of subscribers increased, they realized they needed more power. So in the early 1960s, they built the Apache generating plant out by Dragoon. It's between Pierce and Sunsites and Wilcox. It's a massive, massive power generating plant. That's part of it right there. They created a new co-op within a co-op. All it did was transmission and generation. APCO, Arizona Electric Power Co-op. And it provided power for 4 different electric co-ops: Duncan Valley, Graham, Sulphur Springs, and Trico, which covers Tucson, Phoenix, or Pinal County, and I think part of Santa Cruz. And that's it right there. Now, one of the objections that people have, and it's a good objection, is they're still using coal-fired generators there, and they're hoping to get rid of them, but they're also now using solar generators as well, solar power. So they're trying to get away from fossil fuels and go to cleaner energy. But we get most of our power in Cochise County from this plant. And if they need power from elsewhere, they can buy it from power companies thousands of miles away, thanks to alternating current, Nikola Tesla. Now let's get to Columbus. That's the other co-op we're talking about. Arizona got off right at the beginning. So we had in Cochise County, the REA started as a permanent funded agency in 1936. They had electricity by late 1939. However, in New Mexico, vested interests in the state legislature, lobbyists for the big power companies, did not want these co-ops. So they fought the legislation that was necessary, because states have to also allow electric co-ops to operate according to their laws, because it's inside the state of New Mexico, inside the state of Arizona. New Mexico did not have a law that would allow this to happen until 1939. So co-ops in the northeastern part of the state got off and running right before World War II. Columbus did not. They talked about it, but they never got anything organized. So until after World War II, there was no rural electrification in Columbus, no rural electrification in Animas Valley, no rural electrification in the Hachita Valley, Playas, no rural electrification in Rodeo except for Ray Eddington's power plant and ranchers that had their own personal generators. Most people were still in the second world. This is the current service area for the Columbus Electric Co-op. So this is all of Hidalgo County, Luna County, that part of Grant that sticks down here to get railroad taxes. This is the Deming area that's served by a for-profit company in Lordsburg. But everything outside the rural areas is served by the Columbus Electric Co-op. And as you can see, here's the state line, right there. You can see the Columbus serves, of course, y'all know it. If you live in this part of Cochise by God County, you get your service from Deming, New Mexico. So Columbus actually formed a co-op in 1946, did the same thing they did in the other, in Sulphur Springs Valley, which is have meetings, elect a board of directors, hire a manager, make a plan, go out and make sure that you had the areas wired efficiently, and then apply to Washington, D.C. for your loan, and they got it in 1947. Rodeo had a separate power company. We want to talk about that because it was owned by a fellow named Ray Ettinger. And Mr. Ettinger owned a power plant here, 2 generators. He also owned a gas company. He also sold generators. So he probably sold generators to ranchers and people out here in Cave Creek and in the rural areas. He also charged high rates. And he didn't have a dedicated 24/7 service crew that you could get up in the middle of the night. They may grumble, but they're going to go out there and repair that line or put that pole back up or replace a burnt-out transistor. He didn't have that. So if the power went down too bad. A lot of people were unhappy in Rodeo with Mr. Eddington's power, which from the 1940s through the 1950s up until the 1960s, if you didn't like it, don't get it. So folks like Junior Gomez, for example, I'm sure most of you remember Junior. Poor Hispanic families did not have electric power. They had kerosene lamps, they had privies, they had pumps. So did all the ranchers and farmers that lived out in the Animas Valley, the homesteaders out there going down the boot heel, and everybody else. Second world. Then the co-op was expanded. They got a massive loan. So Columbus is going to go from Columbus and up to Deming. It's instead of just going north and south, it's going to go west and started down towards Hachita. And they bought out the power plant in Hachita and electrified everybody down there on their grid. They kept moving west and they got to Animas, electrified that, went south down the boot heel all the way down to, what's the end there? Antelope Wells? All the way down there, bringing cheap, reliable electricity to people that never had anything but a kerosene lamp. And that bulb came on in a lot of homes that never saw electricity before. Now, let's get to the story of Ray Eddington, who is that rodeo businessman. Ray's electrical power grid was not liked, but he had the certificate to operate an electric company in Rodeo. People kept writing to the Power Service or Public Service Commission in Santa Fe. Those are the folks that handle utilities, such as water and electrical power. They kept writing saying, this man's charging way too much money and the service is crappy. The Columbus Electric Co-op applied for permission to come into Rodeo and compete with Ray Eddington. Ray did not want to share the bounty of his customers, so he, backed by big companies in West Texas and New Mexico, for-profit utilities, sued Columbus Electric Co-op and sued the state of New Mexico Public Service Commission, saying they don't have the authority to do this. That case lasted 2 years, from 1962 to 1964. It was Columbus won. It was appealed to the State Court of Appeals. Columbus won. It made it all the way up to the New Mexico State Supreme Court, and Columbus said, the State Supreme Court said, Columbus wins. Anybody that is on Ray Eddington's electrical grid can leave if they want to and join Columbus. So, off they go. And Columbus got rodeo in its power grid. It also, of course, 1950, 1952, got Cave Creek. So the Southwestern Research Station, all the ranches and everybody else along there, down in Apache, all became part of the Columbus grid, which is why you send your money to Demi, New Mexico, which is where the Columbus headquarters is now located. And that boat was part of Ray Eddington's power system because he had 2 generators in rodeo in a big shed in back of where the Chiricahua Gallery was. And to cool them off, because they generate a tremendous amount of heat, you have to have water. So he had these 2 boats out there with a system to allow water to come in and water to go out to cool off the generators, and that is why that boat is there. Why it's out there on the railroad bed, who knows? So these are the people that keep the power on. These are my heroes right here because they're out there day and night, rain, snow, whatever, to keep civilization operating. So if you see an electrician, particularly if he's a union man, IBEW, shake his hand and tell him he's a hero. And I'd like to end this by telling you about one more person. This man lived in our home in Warren right before we moved in. His name was Ron Mattingly, and he was an electrician for Phelps Dodge. He was electrocuted on the job. It's a dangerous business. So if you see somebody working on a line in a cherry picker, please don't distract them. Thank you for your time.